Welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here today. Welcome to people from different parts of France, Scotland and England, and any other countries that if there are other countries I've not mentioned, I apologise. Oh, and Ireland as well, Thomas. Great to see you. So I've met people before. I've met many, I've got ex-colleagues here, and that's great to see everybody. So welcome to everybody who's joining us today, whether you've been to previous events or you're joining us at the Research Circle for the first time. As people know, we're recording today's event. There are some people who can't join us, who are doing work in other parts of Europe, and we also are recording the event as part of our archive. And as Sharon was saying, the videos go onto the RWF website, Raymond Williams Foundation website. So this is the final event in our latest series of Research Circle events. And in 2024, in the spring and the summer, we met, and today's final event, the overall title is Backward Travellers Looking Forwards. And what we have been aiming to do, and what we certainly are doing today, is reflecting on cultural, spiritual, political, working class histories of education with a view to learning from the past to inform our futures. And in particular today, we're marking the 40th anniversary of the miners' strike with the title of Radical Dissent, Mining, Workers' Education and Strengthening of Democratic Community. So, as the majority of people know, but for others, for a brief bit of context, the Research Circle has met since the autumn of 2020. And our first event was in the spring of 2021. So who are we, and what are we all about? In summary, the origin of the Circle is in the Centenary Commission's 2019 report. And what we're going to do at the end of today is add a link to the Centenary Commission website, and you'll be able to read more on the report and its recommendations. And that itself marked the centenary of the 1919 report on adult education by the Ministry of Reconstruction, as people know, following the First World War. Oops. Disseminate the centenary report. And Sharon led an event at the Cooperative College, initiated our first meeting in September 2020, and it was that first meeting that was the genesis of the circle that meets today. And our working title, as people know from the emails, has been about fostering and building community, democracy and dialogue. So the intertwining of each of those key words, key ideas, key actions. The events have taken different forms, but now we have this 2-hour meeting with 2 or 3 speakers in dialogue with one another and other participants, and that provides the basis for how we normally meet. So at the heart of each event has been this combination between individual and collective struggle that have never been more powerful than in today's event. So today we welcome Linden West, Emeritus Professor, Canterbury Christ Church, who in Nottingham, who has been teaching face-to-face and not online already this morning. So as many of you know, Linden has a long and distinguished history of critically researching lifelong and transformative education, with particular uses of narrative and life history research. And today Linden is speaking about his recent work with Kent miners. Linden's going to speak for approximately 30 minutes, and there will be time for first questions. And then in the second part of the morning, from approximately 10:45, Sharon will give her presentation and lead a discussion on questions and issues raised by it. Sharon will draw on other dimensions of biographical research, and in particular, those of her family and community. And this relates to and connects with Sharon's recent presentation in July on creativity.
Oh, you keep freezing, Ian.
About the different perspectives. So thanks everybody for their participation. Welcome to people from Scotland, from Wales, as Cheryl has reminded me, France and England. So welcome, Linden, and over to you.
Thank you, Ian. It's lovely to be here. I hope I don't freeze. I don't feel as though I'm going to in reality. I don't know about virtually. No, it's wonderful. So let me start with the first slide, Sharon, if I may. I thought it'd be helpful just to have a little map of where I'm going to be talking about, although the spread of the miners of Kent is international, which is one of the themes I want to pick up on. But those who know that bit of England that kind of cuts across the channel is just there. France is here. We're talking about the Kent coalfield, 4 pits, all listed there, and it's surrounded by places that people will have heard of. Canterbury there, slightly to the east, Folkestone and Dover to the south, and Margate to the north. And you'll see the pits there listed: Betshanger, Tilmanston, Snowdown, and Chislett. You'll also notice next to Deal, which has a significant place in some of what I'm going to be talking about, is a little community, now really a suburb of Deal, called Mill Hill. So let's move on, Sharon, if we may. I want to tell a little story within a bigger story, first of all. So I moved to Kent in 1990. To be honest with you, I didn't know a great deal about Kent. I vaguely knew about the disgusted of Tunbridge Wells, and I knew something about, or I'd heard of apple orchards. But when I joined what was then called the School of Continuing Education at the University of Kent, I was quickly aware of the Kent coalfield. I was aware, because of my interests in this, of a fairly vibrant tradition, had been a vibrant tradition of workers' education. I was also aware that some of you may have heard of a strike in the Second World War in 1942 at the Betshanger colliery, which I had understood at that time was the only strike in the United Kingdom during the war. It actually turns out, looking at it in greater depth, there was actually a smaller strike in Yorkshire. But nonetheless, there's something interesting going on here. And in my own head, I thought, well, what is the relationship, if any, between the tradition of workers' education and the reputation for militancy that found in the Kent coalfield, that found expression in that strike? So we did some oral history. We got a small amount of money together, 3 or 4 of us, and we generated 30 or so tapes, mainly of the miners themselves. This is 1992, 93. Many of them were still around. And we also interviewed some of the tutors and also some of the administrators that had been associated with the work. I don't think very much was made of it. It's interesting to ask why. And anyway, to cut a long story short, the tapes ended up in my study in Canterbury, much to the chagrin of my wife, who kept on saying, when are you going to do something about those damn tapes? Fast forward now to 2020 or so. I had actually, and this is relevant, I had actually offered the tapes to various places, including the University of Kent Library, as well as Canterbury Christ Church, where I came to work. Not interested. Not interested in workers' education, not interested in the working class history. Sad, but true, because if you have no one involved in the teaching or the researching of those subjects, on the whole, libraries aren't very interested. Come the year 2020 or thereabouts, I think I felt the desire to do some willful remembering, because from the perspective of 2020 through to 2024, I think the state of things felt very different to me, and the state of memory. So I was well aware from work in other places, the city where I come from, Stoke, of the disturbing state of some of our post-industrial communities. And I was well aware, by then living in Canterbury after, 30 years in Canterbury, of the troubling state, let me say, of the Kent coalfield. It made me want to dig deeper back into history, to backwards travel, to use the framing of the whole series, as a way of kind of understanding more deeply what may have happened, to feed into our discussions about moving forward. As I approached 2024, I felt like many of you, I guess, that John Harris, writing in The Guardian, used the word haunting, and that's what it feels to me like, the 85 strike, things not being resolved. I mean, the obvious things which people will know, like, was this the kind of the beginning of the end for the strength, at least, of organized labor? And of course, we have as well within that, or as part of the story, the rise of the kind of neoliberal zeitgeist. I was well aware, and you will be too, and these words still won't go away. They're part of the haunting, maybe, words like enemies within, Luddites, and dirty coal. So the whole kind of debate now about clean energy is sort of enveloped this whole discussion. That motivated me to want to kind of chronicle in greater depth and do honor, as it were, to the men and women of the Kent coalfield, which we failed to do in the 1990s. The other thing that I think began to motivate me was as I listened to people talking about quite distinguished people like Raymond Williams and Edward Thompson, people like Keenan Malik, distinguished correspondent whose work I very much like, it became palpably obvious to me that either the history, certainly of workers' education, had been lost, was never really talked about in those cultural circles, or maybe just wasn't ever known in the first place. So I felt we had some imaginative cultural work to do as a group, to begin to travel backwards, to reinvigorate our discussions about moving forward. I came across this quote from Milan Kundera from the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia as it was then, that touches on some of my feelings about this. The struggle against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. That's a powerful statement to me. And as part of my work was to recover, reestablish, reinterpret some of the memories of the men and women of the Kent coalfield. And I know that others like Sharon have been doing something similar in other parts of the United Kingdom. The other kind of dynamic within this was I felt it was important to bear witness and to honor. There's an honoring process in memory work. We may disagree. We may have a different ideological perspective, but the point is, I think, in this kind of work, in oral history, in life history or whatever, is to come alongside and to listen empathically, even if we disagree, and to try to understand more of someone's story and the context of that story. Someone who's inspired me in that regard is Jonathan Rose, who I think challenged some of the interpretations, certainly of workers' education, maybe aspects of working class history more generally, in his magisterial book, The Intellectual History of the British Working Classes, first published in about 2001, I think, and then republished in 2010. Within that book, I think we had an ethic of respect and witness, which I wanted to try to replicate in the work I did. Oral history in this context, I use oral history partly because that's the way we started in the 1990s. And I'm reminded in talking about this of Alessandro Portelli, the Italian oral historian, who talked, I think, about oral history's democratic purpose. Crudely, history is dominated by the stories of the powerful. And too often we miss the stories of ordinary folk. Too often we miss the stories of people who've been oppressed. And in that sense, I think the purpose of democratic history is to restore their narratives to the historical debate about what may or may not have actually happened. So that's some of the background to the work I've been doing, if you like, some of the values that informed what I've been doing. And I want to suggest this morning we can learn more about the making of community. I deliberately use the word making. There are echoes there. Excuse me, the great Labour historian Edward Thompson, the making of the English working class. In the old tiresome debate about structure and agency, I want to re-establish a sense of the agency of ordinary folk of making history, as of course Thompson did in his own hugely significant way. I want to kind of talk a bit about the nature of the vibrant cultures of adult education that existed in the Kent coalfield, and the role of a union. In those days, it was the Miners' Federation, the Miners' Association, Kent Miners' Association. Later in 1945, they amalgamated with the National Union of Mine Workers. The commitment of that union was both financial. Workers were encouraged, but also supported financially for their participation in diverse forms of adult education, but also morally. It was a good thing to do. It was an important thing to do. It's not just about you as an individual, it's about the collective. It's about making our community stronger and better and more informed. It's about, if you like, a struggle for democracy and social justice. I also want to briefly touch on an aspect that I think is also forgotten. And certainly some of the miners felt it had been forgotten in more recent times, including the Brexit debate. The importance of internationalism, and then the experiences, the lived experiences of experiments in participative democracy. Our democracy is malfunctioning. Most of us would agree with that. And it's an old story going back to John Dewey, Raymond Williams, and others, that to make a vibrant democracy, we need a vibrant civil society in which the power of participative democracy is at work. Now, in saying all this, I don't want to over-idealize the Kent mining communities. There are questions, and I'll come to that right at the end. Can we have the next slide, Sharon, please? Ian mentioned in his introduction the 1919 report. I want to mention this very, very briefly. 1919, of course, is just after the conflagration of the First World War. And there was a sense of wanting to make the land, if you recall, fit for heroes, which perhaps didn't really materialize. In that report, there's the phrase that is often used, that adult education is a permanent national necessity. Now, although vast resources weren't put into adult education, or workers' education, as I tend to call it in this context, I think it encouraged agencies like the WA and Oxford University to expand their work, and some of that expansion took place in the Kent countryside. Going back before that, of course, some of you will be aware, and there's a touch, there's an element, there's a feel of democracy in some of this, that an earlier generation of worker students had been dissatisfied with the university extension tradition of the lectures, where there was little place to shape what was done, to bring their experience into the debate and discussion. There was, in short, little space for dialogue. Now, I know the history of the tutorial classes, the WA-Oxford alliance is a source of great dispute, but at their best, I think, those classes were, if you like, democratic communities in their own right, where there was a real feel of inclusivity and of dialogue. I want also to mention the Kent Miners' Association, to coin the phrase, or to repeat the phrase of Raymond Williams, generating huge resources of hope. Partly that's about finance and about moral support for learners, both in an individual and collective sense, but it's also helping to build the structure of opportunities that in a sense, the people I'm going to talk about benefited from. So there was emphasis on local provision, including to tutorial classes, but also trade union work of diverse kinds, opportunities for the experience of residential education. Initially, that tended to take place at Balliol College in Oxford. Later, it took place in Ruskin College in Oxford, and later still, it took place in what was by then, I think, called the Oxford Department for External Studies. It has had various names and various iterations over the world, and that really did make a big difference. And as I say, what I want to communicate to you is something quite dynamic. The making of a democratic, learning, cooperative culture among many and diverse miners. Remembering that the first mine opened in Kent in 1912. There were no indigenous miners in Kent. They came from all over the United Kingdom. And frankly, there is history, which maybe also needs to be explored, of difference and disagreement, sometimes violence between people from different backgrounds. And I want to suggest that over time, I mean, clearly, you know, with generations, they settle down, they live in the same area. So some of this might have happened inevitably, but there was a real sense in this that more of a cooperative community was created through things like the union and workers' education as an alternative to difference, violence and rivalry. Can we move on, Sharon, please? Are you there, Sharon? Ah, right. So let me introduce to you two significant figures, not just significant to me, but these people, these two tutors emerge in the testimony of the worker students. Alfred T. Dye, for reasons I think they may have come up, but anyway, in the interview we have with Dye, he didn't like Alfred T, and he preferred to be called Dye, or as some of the students called him, Professor Dye, even though, as John Holford reminds me, he wasn't really a professor, but maybe that says something about his status and his importance to some of the worker students. So we're going back into the 19th century now, born 1898. Left school at 14, worked for the post office and won a scholarship to Oxford. Some of you might know a bit about him because of association with Hewlett-Johnson, who was the Red Dean of Canterbury, who would describe himself, or has been described, as a Christian communist. I will kind of allude to some of that a little bit later. Of the two, it's an interesting question who had most influence on the other. Dye thought he was the spiritual advisor to Hewlett-Johnson. Hewlett-Johnson, some of his work has been criticized as being theologically light. Hewlett-Johnson was interested in Dye because he listened to a lecture undertaken under the auspices of the Oxford delegacy in Canterbury, and Hewlett-Johnson invited him to come and live in the cloisters in the area around Canterbury Cathedral, and they developed a strong relationship, including towards what became called the Socialist Sixth of the World. And there's a pamphlet on the other side of your screen, Russia Revisited, and they traveled a lot to Russia together. Now, I think I do want to nail something here. Dye was a committed left-winger, a communist. There's been a long debate about the Oxford delegacy, how much the delegacy and Oxford University were comfortable with people like Dye. I think there's a danger of a kind of condescension or anachronistic judgment of Dye. And I think also in the case of Oxford, what's important is they tolerated him. In Kent itself, some of the more traditional WA branches didn't take to Dye. He wasn't invited to do any tutorial classes there, but he became a permanent feature in the Kent coalfield. In fact, it may interest people to know that I think we're talking late 20s, early 30s, his tutorial class on international relations was established, and that went on right through into the 21st century. What's important for present purposes is Dye inspired some of the worker students. So here I'm quoting various people. This is from Terry Harrison, who we'll meet in a moment. He would encourage everyone to speak a bit more. He was a very pleasant man to be with and a campaigning teacher. And it's the campaigning teacher, I think, that maybe is important. When I went back and talked about the work with the Miners' Museum in the early 20s, I met Terry Harrison, who played a central role in workers' education. He felt that it was important to reinstate Dye, to do some memory work, to reinstate him in the historical record. And I think what Terry was saying to me, and I don't know whether he's here, he may agree or disagree, is that he was inspired and motivated by someone like Dye to move from being a worker student eventually to becoming a teacher himself. The other person I want to mention is John Thirkell, who was born in 1934. So we're spanning the generations here. John worked for the Coal Board. He was an Oxford graduate. And he also joined the Oxford extramural delegacy. He was a politico. He was interested in political history and politics, industrial relations. He was also a great lover of delphiniums. Nice to see the human side of someone. Handel and Beethoven. And here's another quote from one of the students about the meaning to him. He made teaching look easy and was a lovely man. He encouraged students themselves to become teachers, or as someone else called him, a proper intellectual and a private man. We may debate what we mean by proper intellectual, but these two men, these two tutors representing Oxford University, had a very significant influence on some of those we're going to quickly talk about in a moment. Sharon, can we have the next slide, please? Here's one. I can't overemphasize the importance of Jack Donne enough. Again, we're going to do a generational thing. Jack was born in 1915, and the title Radical Dissent has been used in the introduction. I think Jack would call himself a radical dissenter. Jack worked at Snowdown, one of the pits that we saw in that initial slide, and Betshanger, which had the reputation of being the more militant pit. When Jack talked, one of the early things he said was the feeling of injustice and the danger of working in the mines, an injustice that had a very personal dimension. His elder brother was injured. He could feel angry at some of the mine owners when people were forced back to work before they were fit to avoid paying compensation. And he described rather graphically Snowdown, which is one of the pits we saw. He thought Betshanger, by the way, was a much better pit, as like Dante's Inferno. 7 pints of water you had to drink just to survive for each shift. He was, I think, passionate about Hegel, the Communist Party. He joined a class taught by Dye, the one I mentioned, International Relations, where they covered topics like these: socialism, capitalism, Tom Paine and the rights of man, the French Revolution, the British Empire, and colonialism. Here, Jack said a whole maelstrom of factors created the atmosphere. The Catholic Church, which is interesting, the WA branch, politics and there was politics for breakfast, dinner, and tea. And we might say Jack Donne helped to create or make this culture too. He was generous. A number of other miners from later generations talk of him as a comrade and a mentor. Surprisingly, and I'd not expected this, I came across liberation theology. I've read my Freire. I've written about the liberation theological dimensions of Freire's work. I hadn't expected to find this in the Ken Coalfield. I'd expected to find traditions brought, if you like, by the miners from Wales, from the nonconformist chapel tradition, the sense of, and as they would have seen it, the way this affected our attitudes to the other, that there was a divinity in the other if only we could create the right circumstances in which it could find expression. But liberation theology is another matter, and I don't know what comes to your mind when you think of the Catholic Church and theology. But liberation theology isn't about induction into some hierarchy, some patriarchy, some established doctrine, but it's very much about a quest. And it's also a feeling that the Christian narrative is speaking to the poor and marginalized. And the sense of the suffering Christ speaks strongly to the suffering and oppressed people wherever you are. Freire would have understood that. Sometimes, I think, in the interpretations of workers' education, the religious dimension of things and the way that I've talked about it has been downplayed. And certainly Malcolm Pitt and Jack must have talked about this quite a lot. And Jack was never, although he's a fervent member of the Communist Party, he was never what we might call a secular fundamentalist. He was open to the quest, a bit like socialism. Socialism of a fixed kind is death, but socialism as a living experiment, as a quest for something better, is another matter. And I think Malcolm and he would have had conversations about the religious dimension of human experience in that sort of way. Can we move on, please, Sharon? Terry Harrison is a lovely man. I interviewed him very recently. What I didn't say at the beginning was that I did more interviews when I discovered the motivation to willfully remember. And Terry Harrison, I talked to at great length, an evacuee in the war, born in Brummagem. Left school at 14, eventually joined the Marines, never did me any favors, he said, pointedly in the interview, and we didn't go any further. He was in Malaysia during the Troubles, never did me any favors. He moved to Deal and he married Phyllis, who was the daughter of a Scottish miner who was in the CP. That introduced him to what he called the Red Table in Deal Welfare Club. You know, Deal there was actually, I think, in Mill Hill, but there we are, in Cowdray Square. And this is what he says: the Communist Party basically ran the club. The Red Table was a social occasion, a bit of drinking, but also we spoke of progressive things. Talked about decolonization, independence movements in various British colonies, Paul Robeson and his passport, and what Labour governments weren't doing and why. Plus ça change, plus la même chose. Terry said he was a good listener. And he said we even spoke about women's liberation, even if there wasn't a bloody woman in the room. So the masculine nature of the culture is something we should note. And here's another view on the Communist Party, which of course has had a checkered history and sometimes incredibly negative readings. The CP were incredible. Like Lidice, that I'll mention in a moment a bit more, a real vanguard giving up hours and hours for voluntary work, for the kids and social welfare, educating and socializing. Terry's father-in-law slowly became disillusioned over Stalin, the purges, and Hungary. Terry talks of being sent out to buy, and this was heretical for Terry's father-in-law to buy other newspapers than the Daily Worker, which he did. Disillusioned and eventually left the party. Terry himself talked about him leaving the party and why, and he talked about sometimes things weren't democratic, sometimes people could be very authoritarian. Terry, being Terry, said, I didn't like it. But having said that, he's very generous in the way he talks about the Communist Party's contribution to the making of a more democratized culture. Luddites, remember I mentioned Luddites and the dismissiveness of the dominant narratives around the 84-5 strike. What's revealing in Terry's story, and to some extent in Jack's, is the attention given. They weren't stupid. They realized that coal had its problems, and they spent a lot of time studying diversification, producing pamphlets, and felt passionately that the good management that was achieved from time to time and the structures and skills of the workforce could be used to generate other products. Terry actually went to the old Yugoslavia to study shipbuilding. Now, we might ask why never any of this materialized, and perhaps we know now from our perspective that the government was determined not to listen in any sense to the miners, including when they were talking about very positive things and the regeneration of the mining communities. Going to have the next slide, please, Sharon. And then finally, Phil Sutcliffe, who's born, so we go a generation later, in 1948, left school at 15, did spend a bit of time in Betshanger, I think, and eventually worked at Snowdown. He was one of those worker students who studied locally, then went to Ruskin College, and also the international dimension. So there were regular study programs to various countries, including the Soviet Union. A number of significant things that Phil talked about learning in this international dimension. Jack, that's Jack Dunn, taught me to drink red wine, because 90% of people drink the white wine, so you have far more to drink. And then he talked about and his own disillusionment, his own openness to doubt and uncertainty, if you like, as a lifelong learner in relation to the Communist Party, was summed up in a story he told about the Politburo. They were in Moscow in a bus, and the bus was stuck for a long time in a traffic jam. And via an interpreter, Phil asked the bus driver what was going on, why aren't we moving? And the bus driver explained by the interpreter, well, the Politburo were going to the Bolshoi Valley. Now, there must have been a lot going on in Phil about doubt and uncertainty, but this, as he tells his story, is the final straw. That was enough. He left the Communist Party. This was supposed to be a worker state, as he put it. He also said, in all honesty, Linden, you have to understand that by then the Communist Party was becoming a little bit unpopular in the Kent coalfield. And if you were standing for election to, by then, the NUM, it wasn't good to have a communist tag around your neck. So he left the Communist Party, partly because of disillusionment, but partly, if you like, for pragmatic reasons. He also mentioned Jack, so there's a link back over the generations and the inspiration of people through the generations. And he talks about the 84-5 strike. Orgreave, he was there. Talked about militarization of the police and those awful scenes that we have come to know so well. And Jack, something like only 34 people, scabs and Kent coalfield. It was a relatively small number. But Jack showed moral leadership in that situation too. He told Phil and others, don't pick on the scabs. He understood some of the struggles that they were going through. I think Jack and Phil were real empathic human beings. The other thing that Phil reminds us of is support from the French. Masses of food coming in from the various unions in France during the 1984-85 strike. And Phil said quite intensely, it annoys me about Brexit in this village, because some of that contribution from continental colleagues, by the time we come round to the referendum in 2016, had been forgotten. And finally, there's almost an echo of Raymond Williams, and Sharon will know I love his work and love his writing, most of all his novels from border country. And you probably recall the moment in the railway signal box with his dad and various other miners. And they're discussing the tactics and morality in 1926 of the strike. And they're discussing the movement of trains and the morality of stopping particular trains. And it's almost as if we can imagine a kind of tutorial class coming into shape, a kind of lived participative democracy in the way the thing worked and the way they made decisions, and the sense of the potential of miners, far more than workers, as citizen students, is so strong in the way Raymond writes about that. And we have the same with Phil, that down the mine there's a particular complex discussion going on between a group of miners. Strong feelings are being expressed, but there's also a feeling of dialogue and mutual understanding of those who might not take the same point of view, a discussion of the ethics of what was happening, a discussion of engineering and mining and what might happen if they do this rather than do that. And again, I think we have from this testimony a sense of the of a lived participative democracy. And although they may have differed, although there may have been debate amongst them, all the men, including those who may have been in a minority, agreed to strike on that particular occasion. Something very deeply moving and important about this spirit, as I would call it, of participative democracy, but also of learning and openness, which I think are an aspect of the history. Phil was blacklisted. When his pit closed, he wanted to work in the Channel Tunnel. A number of miners did, but he was known by someone who had been in management, who then worked for the Channel Tunnel Company. He was blacklisted. He went through a very bad time, Phil did, but it's good and moving and important to hear his testimony. Final slide, Sharon. So, community, the making and breaking of a community, is that what we're talking about in 84? Robert Gildear, his important book, talks about the paradox. So I'm talking about community, but in a sense, there are exclusionary mechanisms of men and masculinity in the process. 84, 85 was very important, and I spent time listening to the testimony, the stories of Kay Sutcliffe, Phil's wife. 84, 85, she said it wasn't about the burning of bras, but it was about the ladies, the Aylsham, which is the village where they lived in Kent, the village ladies group becoming transformed into a women's support group. Not so much about the burning of bras, but a firm, assertive statement by many of the women that they were going to be more central because they were desperate about the condition and vulnerability of their communities. Kay's transition is an extraordinary story. She tells a story of speaking at a big event. You can imagine it in Lambeth Town Hall during the 84-5 strike. Tony Benn is just to her right, and she's asked to talk, and she's terrified. A transitional moment in the stories adult learners tell. She's terrified, but she finds someone in the front row who she thinks is very sympathetic. I think it was another woman. And she starts with a line, "I am the daughter and wife of a miner." And somehow the whole audience was stilled. And she delivered a speech which produced a standing ovation. But she also talked about misogyny within the NUM. She talked, dare I say it, about misogyny right at the top of the NUM. She did have conversations with Arthur Scargill, and how can I put it? They weren't 100% positive. She talked about the struggles at a very local level. So the pubs that were segregated, men and women, no, they were determined to use the bars. All people could use the bars rather than the segregation. So little moments of struggle that add up, in a sense, in the tragedy of what happened in 1845 to the making of the community in a more gendered, equal sense. After 1995, stresses and strains in marriages and communities, new forms that we know only too well of economic precarity, of the feeling of abandonment by government, including Labour governments, and hopelessness. But what witnessing the stories of people like Jack, Terry, Phil, Malcolm, and Kay do to me is I really think we learn more about the making of community, as used by in the meaning of making as used by Edward Thompson. We learn about the central role of the union in all its imperfections, in creating a vibrant culture of adult education, of lifelong learning. The practical manifestation of a civic university. We are trying to reinvigorate a discussion about meaningful civic universities. And here in this kind of alliance between the WA and Oxford, which can't simply be resuscitated, we have to think anew. But some of the processes that help to create a living presence of university education in these communities, we can learn from. And also resisting fascist barbarity. I missed the point about Lidizi when I was talking about Terry, sorry for that. Takes me back to Stoke and my own roots in 1942. The then Reichsprotector, as the Germans called it, of Bohemia, Reinhard Heydrich, was assassinated by Czech partisans with help from British special forces. And the Germans, the Nazis, declared that Lidice, a mining community, shall die. In both Stoke and the Ken coalfield, a real connection for me. There was a movement that was established, Lidice shall live. And the Rose Garden, which was on the previous slide, was one of the contributions that the Kent miners made to the re-establishment, the reinvigoration, the bringing back of life to a community that had been devastated. So the inspiration I take from that in our present troubled times is the determination to resist fascist barbarity, the internationalism, the loss of which was mourned by particular miners, and that sense of a lived participative democracy that Phil talked about. And later, and here is my final line, a spirit of gender equality. Then all the suffering and turbulence and trouble of the 1984-85 strike brings with it the positive of a renewed spirit, or a new spirit in some instances, of gender equality. I'll stop there.
Linden, thank you very much. Whereas some of those themes are one I've heard you touch on before, there are also different and new perspectives. So I think that it sort of generates all sorts of different ideas. What I would like to do, if Sharon agrees, and if this kind of works, is if we perhaps take 5 or 10 minutes for any specific comments or reflections on what Linden has said, and then I can imagine there may well be overlaps with or relationships between what Linden's just said and Sharon. Does anybody want to just take in that 10 minutes? Has anybody got any particular either questions for Linden or reflections on what you've just heard? So if you just wanted to unmute, if you have. I'm just going to pause because there were a couple of things that I was particularly interested in. Linden, I wonder, let me just kick off. As I was listening to you, and your point that you made today and was in the booklet that went with the exhibition, you emphasised that the miners in Kent were from different parts of the country, and indeed from, would this be right, also from Wales and Scotland as well as, yeah, okay. So conscious of people being with us today, what I suppose I'm interested in is the extent to which, as people listen to Linden today, for colleagues on the call with us from both the North East and also from the West Midlands and East Midlands, I'm wondering if there are any kind of, if this isn't too big a question, reflections and comments on similarities and differences between the particular stories and histories that Linden has spoken about and those experiences in the North East or West Midlands. I know, for example, we've got Keith with us and Anne, and is it Colleen, all three joining us from the North East. And forgive me if there's others I'm not picked up on. I wondered if any of you had got reflections. Because if not, we could pick up on them later, perhaps.
I would just like to say that listening to
hello, Anne. Yeah.
Colleen here. That
Colleen, sorry, Colleen. Sorry.
He could be talking about the North East, absolutely. The strength of women coming out in support of the situation and the men, and the education is really could be talking about absolutely where I live right now. Yeah.
Well, I think that, well, for me, at the end of your sentence there, right now. So, you know, as well as talking about the women's support group and the miners' strike, could you just say a little bit about what you were just saying then about right now, Colleen? So in terms of the work that you've been involved with others.
I work in a women's education and support project. So really the struggles that women are dealing with are similar, caused by really the same things you can pull it back to. So I'm really glad that we're talking about learning from the past, because that should influence the way that we engage with people now to move forward, so we can see some changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I wonder, Sharon, whether these are things that we could pick up in the open discussion, because I'm very aware that there's sort of, there's a whole range of different national and local perspectives to do with this, to do with other organisations as well. I mean, what we could do, unless there's anybody else who wants to come in and respond now, perhaps we could hold some of these themes, because I can imagine they'll come back and resonate with your presentation, Sharon. Ian, I'm just looking at Ian Hewitt, hand up. Hello.
Just briefly, hello. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. And
yes,
thanks to Linden for taking us through that tour de force, and it evokes all sorts of thoughts. One of which was in Ollerton, in Nottinghamshire, in Sherwood, dramatised recently. There was a response to the closure of the pit called the Sherwood Energy Village. Is anybody familiar with that? A community co-op.
Yeah.
The most shares you could have were 50 quid a go. And it was going to rebuild on the site of the mine an energy village based on, net zero, as we could talk about it. And it was fantastic. But the one of the outcomes of that was of the public health. The public health workers working in the locality could see that Ollerton, with this dynamism going on, was a lot more healthy than villages adjacent who had lost mines and hadn't had the capacity to generate that, sort of social enterprise or cooperative, not social, a cooperative ethos. And the other thing I was thinking of was the importance of testimony. I get involved with the Lucas workers, and to hear from them directly in their words is very different from, people competing to capture the narrative in a political sense.
Yeah.
And that oral history is just so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Sharon, why don't we, because I'm conscious of the time as well. Thanks very much, Linden, and I think that we can follow up at the end with links to the booklet and the website with details of the Kent Mining Museum. So there's opportunities to do, if people want to kind of follow up on what Linden has spoken about today. Sharon, I'd just like to now hand over to the second part of the main part of this morning.
Yeah.
For your presentation.
Very
so
happy
welcome.
to, Ian. Just coordinating between two screens, forgive me, which was where the glitch came earlier. I'm not used to this. I'm going to, just a minute, one sec, get back to the beginning of my presentation. Okay, so I just want to preface my testimony, if you like, today, or my presentation today, with the fact that this is very informal, in the sense that this has not been any kind of specifically funded research. This has just been my attempt to try and find a way of creating a voice for some of the men that I know personally in the northeast Derbyshire mining areas, and to think particularly about the conversations that I've had with them, some of which I've managed to capture, about the experience of training and work as colliers and miners, the importance for them of this kind of, their distinction, if you like, or their refusal to accept a simple binary between vocationalism and non-vocational education, and something around what this transition from collier to miner meant for them, in the context also of my experience of talking to them about living in the Bolsover area, particularly in the aftermath of the 1984-85 strike. And it's worth saying that one of the people that I interviewed, Bill Rodder, was a miner who didn't strike. My father, by contrast, in the 72 and 74 strikes, was a passionate striker and supported other miners in the Yorkshire coalfield areas. So there was a tension there, and I thought it would be kind of interesting to capture some of those issues and just identify them to everyone before I start. So I want to say something a little bit about Bolsover itself. So Bolsover, as people will know probably, is in the northeast of Derbyshire. It's a town that's built and predicated on the mines that have been a constant feature of it until recent history, in that it's based on, most of the housing is state-owned or was. The schools, similarly, the water, the roads, and the role of the NUM is pretty central to Bolsover and its community, and certainly historically. And it's been a network and a way of life for a long time now, since the early part of the 20th century at least. And we see most of these memories and much of this way of life beginning to evanesce now. We see some of it still in old film footage, and particularly for the miners who are left, and both my father and Bill Rodder, who died this year, are no longer with us. So this is something about capturing those shared stories and those memories, frankly, before it's too late, which was another motivation of mine for trying to record and archive some of this material, which I feel is really important. So many of these shared stories and memories are, again, part of this kind of fading experience, this evanescence that I've described already. There's been a long tradition of associational life, if you like, and independent learning connected with the pits, much of which Linden so eloquently described already, and I'll touch on that a little in relation to my dad's experience. Obviously, the community's been riven by the miners' strike of 1984-85, and people will probably know that Bolsover was one of the UDM areas. So we've got this kind of schism between the NUM and the UDM, and some extraordinary scenes in 1984 and 85. And this still goes on, huge tensions that remain. So we've got an enormous history, if you like, of tension and violence in Bolsover and the surrounding areas. And of course, Bolsover has been subsequently stripped of its mining and manufacturing base and the work that was associated with it. But alongside that, many of the social networks and the local institutions that represented. So it's, and I liked Linden's quote, this is really important to me. It's been a place that's been largely set adrift from some of those old continuities and some of that sense of collectivism that we've heard described by Linden. And this is by the profound economic, political and social changes of the 1980s and earlier. So in many ways, and this saddens me and I find very poignant, that really some of the pit headstocks, for example, are still existing in certain communities in the northeast Derbyshire area, but they've largely become markers. Some have become museums, and that's what remains of much of the mining industry. In effect, they've become heritage sites. So we've seen over the last 30 years this breakup of the social and educational traditions, particularly in working class areas like Bolsover, as a result of this huge and seismic economic change and this neoliberal agenda that we've all been subject to. So it's been brought about, in my view, by a receding state, by a focus of attention on the individual. And there's so much of this runs counter to the rich associational life and culture of the working class. And that's certainly what I heard from both my dad and from Bill Rodder in their testimony about their experience of being down the mines, with all the caveats that Linden's rightly identified about the kind of insularity in some ways, the very masculine nature of that community. There's enormous sense of camaraderie, good humour, but also the debates and conversations down the pit, which have always, frankly, surprised and astonished me at the kind of level and depth. And that's not meant in any way in a patronising sense, but that sense of a community in its own right underground. So my hometown now feels very much a community of two halves. We've seen an increase in gentrification. So you've got a lot of people now with scant historical connection who've relocated there. And a consequence of that for me is that we have more and more people who are perhaps more financially comfortable, who engage in the arts-based classes, become part of the parish council, volunteer at the church or the castle, and become part of what you might call a newly established social order. And I think in many ways, a lot of the voices of the mining community have been excluded by that process of gentrification. So I just like this image because it comes on to a little bit to some of my own observations from talking to my dad and to Bill Rodder. And this is this tension between what we mean by miner, what we mean by collier, an image from the Sphere from 1919 in the Bolsover Colliery. So I want to come on to talk about my dad. This is one of my favourite memories with my father. We went back to Ruskin in 2011. My dad had just started to become ill, but you can see here he looks well and extremely happy. He was so excited and delighted to go back to Ruskin to see the old campus at Headington, but also to go back and see his old room. And this was just a huge personal and emotional journey for him. So I'd like to say a bit about my dad just in the context of this very personal testimony. So my dad was a collier for 15 years, and he was someone who did that in a number of different periods, if you like. So he was down Glatwell Colliery, which is quite close to Bolsover, from 1952 to 1958. He began at the age of 14. He was so small, he told me, that he used to be able to fit into the lockers because he was, at that stage, a tiny, effectively a boy. He didn't grow and reach his epic 5'7" status till several years later. But he got out quite early on in the late 50s and actually moved to Canada, a very bold move, saving up so he could travel across to Canada. And he actually worked on the oil rigs for 2 years. And having come back, he came back through America, spent time in New York. He came back and he started work again, back down the pit. But you can tell perhaps for a little from that he had this kind of huge emancipatory kind of urgency. He wanted to, in effect, learn and develop. And he was to gain his place at Ruskin College, having gained a scholarship there between 1974 and 1975. But for the time he worked down the pit, he worked primarily as a chock fitter. What I understood later from talking to Bill, because my dad and I never really talked about the detail of the actual role, was just what a job this was. It could be quite highly skilled work. And Bill said, so they're big metal. So they're built like, if you can imagine, there's a set here and a set there, and this is over a belt or crawley. A crawley is like a chain that goes inside a metal trough that pulls the coal away from as they're cutting it. So if you're doing chocks, these are hydraulics. So as they were going forward, they're like 5 or 10 metal chocks with 4 hydraulics and 6 hydraulic legs, 4 at the back, 2 at the front. A skilled job because you have to follow. You have to snake behind as the machine went through the cook coal. These chocks would hold up 300 tons per square inch. So I just started to get some sense of both the danger and the precarity of this work, but also the huge engineering skill that it required and the knowledge and understanding that it required to be able to do the job well. And this really is part of my point about the importance of training, vocational training, but how that translates into a real world setting. So going back to something about my grandfather on my father's side was John Harold Pierce Landers Clancy, never one for short names, who was a Welsh miner from the Rhondda Valley, and he came to northeast Derbyshire for work in, I think, the 1920s or 30s. He left school at 11. This staggers me. And he was down the pit actually from the age of 11, and he went down the pit in 1910. And he didn't retire until 1964, which I find quite staggering. So he literally spent 50 odd years as a miner. His body was covered in blue scars, which I remember vividly as a child. And my dad was clear in my interview with him that his father had been incredibly influential. My granddad had been very involved with a whole range of different movements, and particularly the Left Book Club, but also the Methodist reading libraries, etc., in the Welsh coalfield. And he was something of an autodidact. He was vastly well read. And he told me in an interview, in my interview with my dad, he'd got all of his works all over the house. He'd write on the back of a piece of board and write a love poem to your grandma. He was a romantic, and he'd write poems like The Sword of Damocles. He wrote many. He got so keen on it. Well, look at the Dickens. He won the complete set in hardback and being a coal miner. He won that for winning a poetry competition. So there's this role of the autodidact that I think is a really important tradition, and one that we do well to remember, the influence of these self-taught men and who were learning actually by talking to others. And also the role of union-funded adult education. So of course we know the trade unions were strong in this area, and day release provision was offered by the National Union of Mine Workers in conjunction for my dad with the University of Sheffield, but also in other areas with Nottingham, Leeds and elsewhere. And the day release scheme in our area was initiated in 1953 by Bert Wynne, who I haven't read anything by, but I must make up for my deficit there. But he was a trade unionist, a communist, and later a Labour Party politician. And he was secretary to the Derbyshire area of the National Union of Mine Workers from the late 40s right up to his death in 66. And my dad did his day release courses at Hurst House in Chesterfield. And of course, sadly, that's now boarded up, as is the way of so many adult education, experimental adult education institutions and places. So I kind of got really interested in how this has fostered this sense of pride in myself, and certainly in my dad, this sense of an intellectual life that perhaps escapes and goes beyond the schooling that my dad received, which only extended to 14, my grandfather only to 11, but how they continued to learn, develop and learn from others. And that's really something to me about the idea of, as Andrew Sanchez describes it, the Labour aristocracy. You might argue with the term, but I really like the idea that those who've known the power of collectivised labour movements and shared action and know their history, which is the important point, I think, often have a different frame of reference. And they know, as Sanchez says, what the good life looks like and how one attains it. So rather than have only ever experienced the kind of negatives, the disadvantages of these stripped back communities, these stripped bare communities, these are people who've had a life of the mind. And I've mentioned my grandfather's own experience and how that then also has been a self-learning trajectory for my father, for my grandfather, for myself also. So the fact that I myself was encouraged to read by both my grandfather and my father, and read extensively beyond the school curriculum when I was only a young teenager. My granddad left me his volumes by De Quincey, Jack London, and of course we have this kind of rich learning history that I was gaining from my father as well, and the many books he had in the house. So I feel I've been the beneficiary of this whole creative, imaginative world that were inhabited by my father and grandfather. And this has influenced my own reading, writing. They were all both very passionate about poetry, about film, about music. And they both neither really talked about education in these kind of binary terms between vocational and non-vocational. My dad, at his experience at Ruskin, talked passionately about this intertwining of sociology, psychology, history, philosophy, almost a kind of cultural studies type of approach in his learning at Ruskin. And I felt that they were both really trying to understand culture in its many complex forms. So very interested in study and analysis and political criticism. We had many debates at home, watching television, just as part of our day-to-day discourse. So they were interested in deconstructing these divisions of knowledge. And they did not separate vocational learning from non-vocational learning, as evidenced by my dad's specific experience in social work. So my dad did his day release at Hurst House, as I've said, and he did it alongside 10 to 15 other students, and all, according to my dad, were working class students, mainly miners and electricians in terms of the other occupations he encountered. And he said from the start, the whole learning experience was a great source of imaginative emancipation for him. And that the works of John Stuart Mill, for example, discussions about the human experience, such as hedonism, he said these were things that sounded magic in my mind, as he described it. But he was still having this massive internal tussle. He didn't know whether he should apply to Ruskin. He was extraordinarily unconfident, having had a fairly poor school experience, despite the fact that he was clearly bright. He didn't actually have much self-belief, my dad, he never did. And he left it until after the deadline had passed, actually. But a student had been whispering Ruskin in his ear for weeks. He told me this with great glee, trying to encourage him to apply. And he finally submitted his application essay, which I've read, which is a beautiful thing for me, that I still have his essays. What aspects of contemporary social life need more studies by the social services? And we had no money, so he hitchhiked down to Oxford for his interview, and 2 days later he found out that he'd gained his scholarship to study for a CQSW in Ruskin. And he was always clear that this was a minor act of rebellion, his own education, that of my grandfather's too. It was something about railing against the establishment. His way of putting it was the right wing didn't like us to improve ourselves. But this was a traumatic as well as transformative experience for my dad. You know, on reaching Ruskin or getting there, he said just the name alone scary. A new environment, leaving your mum and you two, me and my brother. I had to try and find a way of financing it. I couldn't afford anything, fares or anything. Sometimes starting really early morning to get there. He would often have to hitchhike virtually in the middle of the night. And he was immediately confronted with having to start work straight away on an essay. He had no idea how to approach this. A plenitude of different essays for different subjects. He said the first official essay that they wanted from me, what do I understand by the term poverty? I struggled. But he remembers the lecturer vividly, a wonderful man, Jewish. This is Raf Samuel who he's referring to. So this extremely exciting, despite training or developing professional skills, if you like, to become a social worker, he very much saw this as a vocational, non-vocational mix. In fact, I don't even think he would have used those terms in terms of professional development, child safety, and also we'll go on to think about safety in a broader context with Bill's testimony, as well as the intellectual stimulus. The course had an extraordinary breadth, and as well as extraordinary tutors. So he was taught by Graham Hamlin, psychology, Michael Barrett Brown in economics and sociology, and Raf Samuel in history, who I've mentioned. And I asked him what he thought when he looked back on his experience at Ruskin, which certainly marked him for his whole life. And he would talk about it with great joy and passion. Often to my mother's irritation, he would say they were the best 2 years of his life, which didn't go down well. But I think it was both extraordinarily hard for him, and he cried often, he told me, lying in his room, wondering if he'd done the right thing. But he also told me little moments, hitchhiking down to Oxford. On one occasion, he said, I still have very strong pictures. I always remember this fellow giving me a lift and asking me what I was doing. And I told him about going to college and that I was a coal miner. And he said, oh, from digging holes in the ground to digging in people's minds, is it? I thought that's really quite a clever thing to say, a lorry driver. Quite simple, but it brought everything home. And then later he said, I've never touched that qualification since leaving college. I didn't feel the need to. I'd proved the point and went back to full-time work with psychologists and sociologists and you name it. And I was mixing with these people, not in any inferior way. In fact, sometimes better, because I'm on the floor, you know. So his experience, his lived experience as a miner really influenced his time as a social worker. So moving on to Bill Rodder. Bill was a friend of my dad's. They had some tension, as I've said, during the 1984-85 strike, because Bill was still working down the mine. My dad, of course, by that stage was a social worker, but Bill worked throughout the strike and was very angry about the ballot issue relating to Scargill's decision. Bill sadly died this year, in April, in fact, and I was very fortunate to interview him a couple of years ago at some length, him and his son Richard, who's a friend of mine, who was also down the pit. So Bill was down Markham and Bolsover collieries from 1953 to 1992, so a total of 39 years. And he talked very poignantly about his experience first as a pony driver, as a very young miner or collier when he very first started. And then he described himself as a collier first, then a miner. And he talked to me a little bit about what the differences were between being a collier and being a miner. They're probably fairly obvious when you think about it, but it hadn't occurred to me. So he said the collier is a stimpman, which is different to what I did at Bozer and Markham. A stimpman is when you have to fire your coal and fill it out of your hand. So if you were using any mechanical devices, you're a miner. If it were by shovel, you're a collier. And he started at Markham very, very young, at the age of 15, as my dad even younger. And he finished school, literally described this to me, at the Christmas. His birthday was the December and started January the 1st. He said, you didn't get any bank holidays then. And he had to do immediately, all miners had to do a 3-month stint training on coal, as he described it, at Markham and later at Grassmore Training Centre. And that was an experience that my dad reflected on, the vital importance of this period of training, when they learned about propping, they learned about using equipment and materials, etc. And this becomes more and more apparent and important as we go on. He said there was a kind of constant throughput of miners, quite overwhelming, thousands literally employed at Bolsover and also at Markham. He described this to me. But he said at each pit there were hundreds of us. He means the new recruits. It would be surprising. We had to share 3 lads to a locker. It had to be worked as one was at the pit, one was at school, one was on the surface. In other words, there was not enough to go round in terms of the space and materials and resources available. So they had to be sure there wasn't any kind of clash. And he said, so you didn't clash getting showered and that, because in other words, you know, you needed to be enough space for people to clean themselves. And he talked to me quite a lot about the technicalities of working down the mine and about the seams and about the management of the mine. And I found this absolutely riveting, actually. He said what they'd got to do, what they worked out was they'd only got to control the next 3 strata above, and the rest will look after itself. But what they used to do is, as your dad would drop the chocks, because he was talking about my dad's experience as a chock fitter, so the chocks would come down. So you've got nothing to hold it up. Then he'd draw it in, slide it in with a hydraulic ram on front that pulled it towards the snaking Crawley change I've mentioned already. It would pull it across to that and then push it back up. Now everything left behind is called the gob, which is all the material that's left. And it just used to drop. But sometimes it didn't used to drop until it was about 100 metres, 50 metres. And then when it came down, it was like the world was coming in. And Richard, Bill's son, told me about this terrifying moment when he was trapped and this huge fall occurred, and he really thought that he'd met the end of his days. He said it was so impossible to see. The coal dust totally filled the air, so they were blind in this situation as well, trying to get from, didn't know which end to try to get towards. And it was only as it gradually cleared that they realised they were able to get out. So some horrifying moments. So the importance of safety and engineering skills and knowledge, it cannot be overemphasized, I don't think. And that really takes me to my last slide, not to end on a difficult note, but I do remember the siren going off as a small girl for the 1973 Markham colliery disaster, and I remember it as a haunting moment, this siren echoing over the valley very, very early in the morning. And this was Monday, 30th of July, 1973. And 18 miners were killed at Markham Colliery in Bolsover on this date. And what happened was the cage carrying the miners to go underground into the pit failed to stop. And as it says here, it was the start of the day shift, and by 6:20 a.m, 105 miners had already been lowered into the pit. And then the overlap rope cage carrying 15 men on the top deck and 14 men on the lower deck began its descent. Sparks were seen coming from the brake cylinder by the engine winder, who then slammed on the emergency stop button. Nothing happened, and the cage crashed down to the bottom of the pit, some 1,329 feet below ground. The ascending cage crashed through the winding house at the roof, and 13 men died at the scene. Another 5 men died later in hospital. The other 11 men in the cage and 1 rescue worker were very seriously injured, were taken to hospital in Chesterfield. And Bill told me that one of his friends was one of those who was badly injured, and he was in hospital for a year following the incident. He vividly remembers how it could very easily have been his own brother. He was meant to be on that shift, but he was saved by the fact, bizarrely, but that his own brother-in-law happened to die on the same day, and he'd been called to the hospital to see him and to support his wife. So he was obviously spared, if you like. So for me, this was this central role of training and the importance that my dad both alluded to, and Bill clearly, and also Richard in his later testimony about working as a miner later into the 80s and 90s. These were vital and central to mining. But this also, if you read the bottom in the bottom of the newspaper clipping, it's unfortunately it's cut off part of it, but it says when the double-decker cage, I think it is, carrying 30 men down to the seam crashed to the bottom of the shaft. The accident, thought to be due to mechanical failure, I think, happened despite 14 fail-safe devices. So this constant need for change, development and understanding of engineering developments to prevent these kind of terrifying and tragic incidents. There were changes after the Markham disaster. When the man riding, and this is from Bill, when the man riding cage hits the top, it cuts it off. So in this case, the disaster, that was flying off at the top. It flew through the headstocks, and then the rope came out. Because the rope hit the bottom and one hit the top due to the ballast, the rope snapped off it and it flirted out. Can you remember them big wheels at the top? Well, it came off of the big wheel and it destroyed the cage and just went straight through the winding house and ended up on the floor. So after the Markham disaster at the top, he said, they've got a mechanism at the top. When the man riding cage hits the top, it cuts it off. So these constant senses of change and development in terms of understanding. That's really all I wanted to say, but I just hope that gave a bit of insight into my own experience, if you like, through 2 voices about the experience of the North East Derbyshire miners. would like to say that Bill was adamant that he did the right thing, not strike him, and could talk to me very cogently about his decisions and his and how he'd come to those decisions and the logic of it. So always a source of tension between him and my dad, interestingly, right up to the very end. But they were also great friends. My desire actually is to find some time somewhere so that I can actually do far more of this gathering of testimony, because I think it's so important before we lose these really important voices and people who remember the experience of actually being down the pit. Thank you very much.
Sharon, thank you. I think that was, I mean, complimented Linden's presentation, but was so powerful because of well, both your conclusion and the earlier points as well. Can I open to others to make reflections or ask questions of Sharon? I mean, people might want to just pause and have a think about that, because there was a lot to take in there, but there have been some comments in the thread which link to my earlier questions, but I wonder whether people have got anything to ask Sharon. And perhaps I could invite Linden, having made the first contribution, whether you've got any immediate responses, Linden.
If I may.
Yeah.
Oh, I really enjoyed that. It was brilliant, Sharon. Thank you.
Thank you, Linden.
It's the best of what I would call auto/biography, if you know what I mean. And what it does when you work in that way, and I noticed here in one of the chat responses, it kind of resonates in your own life, and you're drawing on your own bits of subjective experience, your memories, to make sense of what it is you're saying. And I noticed autodidacticism spoke to a number of people. When I was doing the work with the miners, I didn't use the word this morning, interestingly, autodidacticism, but it was very strong in the Kent coalfield. But what it reminded me of was my own family. And part of my own journey is to go back to, I mean, it was the extended family. So when I'm looking and imagining books in Mill Hill Club in Deal, I'm also seeing the books which were extraordinarily eclectic in their range, of my great uncle, Joe, who would talk, avidly about everything from astronomy, astrology, and politics as well. I'm just glorious. And I think I'm aware when I do this kind of work, and this is what resonated for me in what you said, I'm taken back to my own roots. Of course I am. And I'm taken back to Stoke. Stoke, as you know, is a mining area as well. Mining was crucial to the development of the pottery industry, iron and steel. And it's making it all come alive again. And that was what's so brilliant in your presentation for me. It's almost as though my Uncle Joe is there and reminding me of his reading and his history. And that's what memory work can do, I think. It's not just the memory of the individual who's talking, it's the auto/biographical dynamics, the way it brings to life again some of our own subjective history. It makes it so glorious and so important.
Yeah, absolutely, Linden. And I felt that very powerfully putting the slides together, actually just reminded me. But I also I just feel very struck by these kind of passionate and powerful men who've talked and thought and laughed and joked together, and whose history is important to hear. I think that's what really struck me. Yeah. And the power they got from talking to one another, sharing with one another. Yeah, there's some really great points in the chat. Sorry, I'm only just getting to it because I couldn't see it while I was doing the presentation. Absolutely recognise, the kind of range of reading that people have experienced, looking around them. Anne talks about the challenges of being an outsider as well. And my grandfather experienced that, I might say, coming from Wales. He was always considered an outsider. It took, even as children, my brother and I were considered to be new because we hadn't been in the village. We'd only come to the village, if you like, through my grandfather having arrived. So we, you know, it's really interesting how it takes a very long time to be accepted as anything other than an outsider. So yeah, just thought I'd respond to that, and the sheer range and power of the books and materials that people have experienced through their own families.
If I could say something, is that okay?
Yeah, of course.
Colin here, and I'm just seeing Rob sitting not far away, as it were, visually, but of course physically it's miles. But he and I were there in Staveley, not in Bolsover, which is only about 3 or 4 miles away.
Yeah.
And Rob and I were there with Linden, in fact, very recently for the launch of the book, which Rob and I both contributed to, about the work back just before the Markham disaster. And what I was struck by this time when we went back was to see how poshified the whole thing had become, as it was not like it didn't seem as if there were any working class people living there at all. It was all middle class people had moved into Poolsbrook. Poolsbrook was a dirty dump when we were there, you know. And
I know.
but now it's become entirely middle class and quite posh people who can afford very big, fancy houses are living there, and also in parts of Staveley too. And then I remember Rob, who played cricket, and we found the cricket pitch again. It hadn't changed as far as I could see. But the other thing I think I wanted to say was I was remembering also walking through Staveley back then in 1969, 70, 71, which is when Rob and I were there, and you would bump into miners and electricians and women working in the new light industries and huge housing schemes where I always felt they always looked so standardized, you know, and I just wondered who the hell lived in there, but it must have been all the workers in all the villages who lived in there. And it was as if I heard some voices. I want to say one last thing. I remember going to huge meetings of the miners' union before the 72 strike. And these were monstrous meetings, you know. There must have been more than hundreds of people in them. There were more like thousands of people. The room was full, and there were always the top table, which consisted of the MP and the other MP and miners' union officials, and nobody really spoke from the floor at all, but there were thousands of guys there. And on the other hand, when I was at meetings that Rob organized or I organized, we were operating a different kind of communality. It wasn't collective, thousands of people standing listening to the top table. It was conversation and discussion and disagreement and trying things out. Is that right, Rob? That's what I felt very strongly about that contrast. And so there was something about the old NUM experience, as I experienced it, as I observed it, which was kind of different from what you're talking about, the horror of that tragedy of the cage falling, and the experience of Bill Rodda and your father, and which these are very personal experiences. But I'm losing the point now that I want to make. It's that contrast, really.
Yeah.
Between the different kinds of learning. And I don't imagine there are many meetings of hundreds or thousands of trade unionists standing listening to the top table anymore. Maybe there are.
No. I think Jim as well. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks. There's Jim.
You're on mute, Jim.
I know Colin. Last time I saw Colin was before electricity was invented in 1976. We were involved in the Tenants Association in Scotland,
Right.
and we both ended up at Edinburgh University as mature students. Where does your dad's equivalent or your mum's equivalent today, now that there's no Ruskin, or that whole vista of Newbattle, Fircroft,
Yeah.
off? I think that's a very big question. How do
It's
you?
an extremely big question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim, I just want to thank you for raising that, because that is my absolute passion, to be honest, and it is exactly what my research is about and what I want to do more of, if I can, as I alluded to, find funding and time in which to do it. That is absolutely my passion, because it's about where people go now. Colleagueholic's not there. You know, you've lost so many of the important colleges that have been influential and important for people from the kind of backgrounds I'm describing, and they aren't there. And I don't see any other routes in, and without being gloomy, but before they kind of vanish entirely, I think it's really important to kind of really identify their experimental nature and archive and chart them, hear from people who've experienced them, and really make it something other than a historical archive, make it something about, we want this again. It may have to change, as Linden said, we can't replicate things, but that kind of that space for people to learn, like my dad did, has gone. Yeah. It grieves me, it does. Ian.
Well, just to hope this connects, I find myself at an adult skills fund.
Lucky you.
Consultation meeting. I went as a delegate from, I said that I was from New Lucas Plan, and a friend of mine was from the Derby Climate Coalition. And we found ourselves in this room full of what they call education providers. And I thought it was a huge laugh winding these people up that were running the session. But afterwards, I was completely drained and really angry, because it was all about skills. They'd got this structure of levels of skills, and they'd said that the current system had failed, and that they'd accumulated a whole lot of data that they wouldn't share with anybody, but was going to justify the next stage of this skills journey. And they wouldn't listen to any. I didn't even recognise that adult education or free air or any of those ideas existed.
No,
we're just ignorant. But they've got control of, the funds for the next, 5 years.
Yeah.
And
yeah. I'm afraid we have to be very, very afraid.
Yeah.
I mean, Ian and I were at the Scotria conference, which is standing conference, university teaching, research, education of adults, back in July, and we were witness to an entire panel plenary, which was about adult education and lifelong learning, and as it was described, and it was all about skills, micro credentials. The world that I recognise and have been trying to describe through my work just didn't exist for these people. So we do have to keep really fighting. It is very disheartening, but I think at least while there's some of us still, trying to punch this message home, if I can put it that way, we have to be there. We have to keep providing this alternative space. The research circle provides some of that. I'm very grateful to it, because it gives me, I don't know about others, but it provides a space where we can actually talk about things that matter.
Sharon, I suppose a question that is raised by what you just said, and Ian's kind of earlier comment there about that meeting in Nottinghamshire, what it kind of resonates with is, if we've got a context as we have now in England, where you've got money going to what are called those mayoral or combined authorities, to what extent is that emphasis on skills universal across the country, or to what extent in different parts of the country, this is whether this is a slightly counter view, I don't know, and whether this is, you know, hopelessly optimistic or naive, is are there spaces in different parts of the country where at a big picture level you actually can have that combination of the vocational and the non-vocational. I mean, you spoke, you know, really powerfully about your dad and friends and their work and how in their lived experience they combine the two. Yeah. So it seems to me that you've got people who lived a life where they didn't see that distinction, or they actually thought both were universally were of use. But then at the big picture, we've got this emphasis on skills, which is pushing out all other forms, or the only place where you've got those wider forms of education are ones that people have to pay for, and that are not run by local authorities, for example, and not run in the old ways, but are now, in a sense, in a privatized world, where people who used to work perhaps for a local council are now setting themselves up and running courses. So I don't know, you know, whether either from your point of view, Sharon, or for Ian, taking Nottinghamshire as an example, is it possible to be optimistic? Or is it the fact that, as Ian's described that example of the emphasis on skills and funding, that this is what's going to lock in all the work that's been done and push out any other forms?
That appears to be the trend, doesn't it? And but I am given courage, not so much by people going private and setting up independently, though that does happen, and people paying for the privilege, or paying more for the provision they perhaps would have done, by the fact that we at least keep trying to get this message over about this kind of life-wide lens. And there's the Lifelong Learning Manifesto, for what it's worth, which the Centenary Commission campaign group have been working on and now getting out to all new MPs. This is the current plan. And as others on the call will know, there's been that Lifelong Learning Manifesto and also the recent pamphlet that John Halford's been involved in writing with Howard Stevenson and a couple of others. Really importantly, that's going to be that's UCU supported. So you know, we've got some possibilities, I think, for not just keeping the message alive, but kind of promoting the message actively. I don't know whether it's going to work. I guess all we can do is keep trying, to be honest. Matthew, I think you were...
Yeah. So I've got a bit of bad news and a bit of good news. So in both, I work for the TUC, but I'm also president of the WEA. And in both of those, obviously, we engage a lot with all the combined authorities. And the bad news is it still seems to be very much skills led, very like narrow employability focus in all of them across the board. You know, because it's all about linking people to getting a job in a very immediate sense. So, you know, a hairdressing course is very worthwhile because you can see the very immediate link there. But a history course, well, that not so really, because I don't think there's this understanding of the link of getting those deeper skills. That said, I think what seems to be changing, and a lot of it's to do with lockdown, is education and I hate the word skills, but skills as a health intervention, because they've recognised that it really helps with like isolation, also with the elderly population, whereby, you know, it's a form of, you know, arresting the mental health crisis that we've got, and so that in a weird way could be salvation for community education, or, you know, learning sake, as it were. The only problem with that is pots of money, because it's all very siloed. So a health intervention is paid for by, you know, the Department of Health, not the Department of Education. And then, of course, you throw combined authorities into the mix, and you know, the pottery, the postcode lottery. there's a lot of factors there, but I think that will only grow as a way of looking at things.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Matt. Thank you. I've certainly picked up that whole issue about well-being, if I dare use the word, which seems to be more and more of a contemporary agenda, and rightly, and also issues around citizenship, however that's defined. So yeah, Linden, I think you were next as well.
Unless somebody else wants to come in, because
I think I think it's just Ian. I don't know whether your hand's still up, Ian, from last
Oh,
time.
sorry.
well, I'll go quickly then.
Yeah.
John wants to come in.
Oh,
But,
John,
yeah. I think the issue is a big one. On the point about skills and education, I think going back to the Kent miners, it's a point I didn't make because of the shortage of time. I remember someone like Jack Dunn saying, I think it was Jack Dunn, you had to learn the vocational side, because if you didn't, you'd be slaughtered in a meeting with management. And the Kent Miners Association did invest quite heavily later, the NUM, in vocational education as well. Partly because it was a good thing to do, partly, I guess, because obviously they wanted safe places, but also it was part of collective bargaining, if you like, and it was part of building something which was more sustainable. So I think that point is entirely taken. One of the things I'm thinking, and I do hear this despair, and Ruskin, where I certainly did part-time work for a while, these places closing, but I think we can be slightly anachronistic in the way we look back at the peoples we've talked about. They didn't know what the future was. When they were struggling in the 1920s and 1930s to do these various things, they didn't know there was going to be, well, that the outcome historically was going to be very complicated, but included giving birth to very powerful things that we are talking about now.
Yeah.
We're inheriting that, and I think it's possibly dangerous to assume, those in history, look how well they did relative to us. No, men and women make history, but never in conditions of their own choosing, and we have some work to do. The final point, and it takes me back to Raymond Williams, I think, Sharon. I've been talking about this with a dear friend and colleague who I keep on encouraging to write a novel, which has an adult education dimension. We have to appeal to people's hearts and imaginations as well as their minds. I think educating Rita has done its bit.
Yeah.
Now we need almost new novels or new writing, new poetry, new literature, new films.
Yeah.
Which can touch people's hearts as well as their minds. And you and I have both written bits for the Forum, special issue of Forum, which is coming out, I think, in November, and it's all very worthy, and I think the writing is okay and will speak to some people, but it's the bigger issue than that.
Yeah.
I think we need to do the kind of work which Raymond called us to do. It's not all about the struggle in the material sphere. It's also about what we can contribute in a cultural level, to stir people, to make them say, that sounds an interesting idea. I mean, I think actually you've been doing some of that today through your own personal testimony. And actually, if we're very honest, Sharon, aspects of adult education history have not sometimes been good at that kind of very personal, emotional, imaginal dimension of human experience. It's been a bit rational, it's been a bit intellectual. And if we're really going to speak to more people, I think collectively we have to take some responsibility to encourage our mate to write that novel, the bit of poetry. It's cultural work as much as anything else we need to do.
No, I totally agree, Linden, actually. And just wanted to say that I'm trying to do my own bit, actually. I've just produced a volume of poetry, some of which is about this very area. So, the whole imaginative work we need to do is pretty vital. I think it's John, and then Ian wanted to come back, I think, and then Rob. Hi, John.
Hi, Sharon. So nice to see you again. I haven't seen you since 2019, and so nice to meet you, Ian.
Hello,
So nice to see
and
Colin
you.
Kirkwood and Jim Mowat. And it's just from a Scottish perspective, and from my research, and it's difficult not just to have a stream of consciousness here because of the depth of the discussion about Raymond Williams and a structure of feeling. This is the concept that grasps me as a structure of feeling. The hauntology that Derrida talks about for Marx and for the minds, especially in the areas that my research is in Midlothian, where it had the biggest pit nearly in Western Europe, in Monkton Hall, and then they got rid of that in 1993, and the drug deaths went kind of through the roof. So there's a thing about alcoholism and drug deaths that marry into the history also of the National Union of Mine Workers, especially in Scotland. I mean, we're talking about individual stories of some of the miners in Kent. I mean, one of the greatest figures really in Scotland was Lawrence Daly, who was the leader of the National Union of Mine Workers before Arthur Scargill, and he died of Korsakoff psychosis. He died through Colin Kirkwood's and the Adult Learning Project. We tried to get Lawrence Daly to speak to us, but he was dying in Barnsley. It was quite difficult to find. But as an intellectual, he was an autodidact. He was a miner. He came out of the Communist Party in 1968 after the Stalinists invaded Czechoslovakia and set up the Fife Socialist Party. And he also was one of the founders of the New Left Review, along with Stuart Hall. You know, he spoke on colonialism. He spoke on colonialism in Scotland, which is, I mean, Colin Kirkwood's investigated that along. And the thing that I was saying to Shara the last time I saw her, that E.P. Thompson wrote the book, The Making of the English Working Class, because Scotland's got a specific and different history. Yeah. It's got the highest, and this is the social murder. Engels talks about social murder. I wonder if there's a social murder taking place in Scotland, along with this international, you talk about internationalism, the international murder that's going on as we speak. And it keeps coming up in the Edinburgh Gaza Genocide Emergency Committee as a Lucas plan, because we've got Leonardo's, the arms manufacturer in Edinburgh. We're trying to close it down. Palestine Action have been in. We've got a campaign. It'll be talked about on Saturday, where we're following a coffin after a piper talking about the invasion of Lebanon and the genocide in Gaza. The social the Lucas Aerospace alternative workers plan. If we've got the control of the weapon of the means of production, you know, it's Mike Cooley, it's Michael Barrett Brown, the Institute for Workers' Control. Yeah. If we've got control, we can create things that will be of social use. This is a great message you're talking about of socialism. If we've got control, but the trouble with the impending doom and apocalypse, you know, will there be a socialism or barbarism? Barbarism looks much more on the cards, and where there's despair, how do we give hope? That's the kind of difficulties in which we're faced. So we're marching behind this coffin, dressed in black. We're not going to be shouting on Saturday because of the ongoing genocide and the increased threat of all-out, perhaps atomic war. So it's nuclear war. So excuse my stream of consciousness. I'm just so struck. Also with the memories and the genealogies, Sharon's genealogy of her dad. I mean, it's just beautiful. It's just wonderful. I mean, when I was in Nottingham, it was in 1984 during the miners' strike. I was chair of the Labour. I mean, we hate the Labour Party. I hate them. I hate Starmer so much. I hate the bastards so much. But I was chair of the Labour group at Murray House when I was doing community education. And I was a member of the Institute for Workers' Control, and I was sent down to Blidderth, which was a striking mine in Nottinghamshire, and it was unbelievable. And they said to me, excuse my naughty, they said some pitch folk in, New York basketball stars, and we get some fucking jock student, Take a drink, they kept saying to me, take a fucking drink. I said, I can't drink. And then they threw me on a train back, you know, fuck off, jock, you're a fucking menace. But it was just unbelievable, unbelievable histories, and that are, I mean, that's the lovely thing about that Ken Loach thing, the Royal Oak, you know, the danger of losing our history. Because they want us to lose our history.
I know, and
so I'm terribly sorry for us. It's just so lovely to be here. It's so lovely to see all these interesting genealogies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Lovely to hear from you again. I think I've got Ian and then Susan, who also messaged me in the chat saying, I can't put my hand up, can I speak?
I just briefly, I've completely thrown by John's brilliant intervention. But I was going to get back to the skills thing and the gloom and doom that I kind of may have precipitated. Going back to Lucas and Mike Cooley, skills were what he was about, but a different version of skills that accommodate tacit knowledge. And tacit knowledge is about community, is about ethics. And I used to teach for 20 years or more in engineering at Trent. And the distinction between a professional engineer and a technician was a technician could be instrumental and would just get on, come what may, gas oven or whatever else it happened to be. A professional engineer was supposed to bring into bear this broader concept of what is, you know, socially useful. I mean, they would never say that because they hated going that far, but there's something in that, a kind of moral ethics base to skills, and I think that's gone. It's been instrumentalized.
Yeah.
The final thing on Cooley's terms, people operate now on data. You push data into a computer and you get an answer. In Cooley's terms, there's a hierarchy: data, information, knowledge, wisdom, and action. And if you put an education policy together, it seems to make sense to me to use wisdom as the guiding point rather than data, which is what these people were using. So
absolutely.
Just a few thoughts.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Ian. Sorry, I think I may have missed Rob. Apologies, Rob. I think you had your hand up ages ago, so I'll just ask Rob and then Susan.
No, I dropped my
did you?
hand.
Okay.
No, but I've come back.
Hello again, Rob. Anyway.
Hello. I didn't mean to drop it. Thanks so much for the case studies. That's really very, very powerful. One or two practical things. Firstly, I really endorse the fact that adult learning has not played and not made enough connection with the health and well-being agenda. I do think that the sense of self, the mental well-being dimension of adult learning is so powerful in addressing a major raft of concerns at community level. And yet I do not, certainly locally in Leicestershire and Leicester, I don't see, well, partly the capacity of the statutory adult learning processes to get involved. And the WEA is also spread far too thinly, but it has so much to offer. My major concern as a community worker on 2 estates in Leicester at the moment is that I mean, it's a lot, it even happened with Colin and I and Staveley. People had lost sight of themselves as learners, the commodification of learning and the front loading of learning and the loss of the autodidact. I was feeling very romantic, if you like, in relation to the 2 case studies we've had this morning, because that is so powerful. And the only way that I can see us moving forward, what I'm struggling with, but doing is biography and autobiography of community members. Taking stock. We've got 1 or 2 projects going, taking stock, your story counts, this type of thing. Based on the Barbara Haight model or the James Byrne model from the States. And it's allowing people to see themselves as having agency, what they have achieved. Yeah, my life's not been so shitty after all, has it? Said somebody who was involved in these 6 or 7 sessions of autobiography. And something I'm wanting to link that to is, I don't know how much experience any of you have got of the Alan Tuff approach in the 70s of individual learning projects. I think he was a Canadian professor who reckoned that despite all the industry at that time of group-based learning led by a professional, it was outweighed in numerical terms by the number of people who in their private lives were just pursuing individual learning projects. They didn't call them that necessarily, but they were sort of a softer form of autodidacticism.
Yeah.
And it's the catalyzing of that type of thing and the support for individual learning projects, I think, that has something which we could possibly build on to enable people to recapture their sense of self as a fully functioning human being with learning at their core.
Oh,
but thanks so much for the stimulus. It's been gorgeous.
Thank you so much for that as well. That's a great point, I think. And Susan, just finally, sorry. I saw your message in the chat, but
I found my hand. I had to search for anyway. I was really struck. I want to come back to the issue of health and well-being because that's a really important one. But I was really struck, Sharon, when you talked about gentrification and how new people have come into the area and they've basically taken over. And it suddenly struck me that in my world, as some of you know, I'm working on a history of an adult education institute in Norwich, which was closed at the end of last year. And yes, it was basically the middle classes and older people who remembered it, who sort of, in a way, ran out of energy or didn't quite have the energy. But trying to contact local councillors was really interesting because none of them really gave any support whatsoever. And the new people who'd come in, who now live in the area, where this institution was cited, they're not really interested because they weren't really involved in it. And in a way, they've sort of shut down the debate. I mean, that none of the councillors at all, but the city council, the county council, and it's the county council that shut it. But none of them, they sort of replied to emails and they came along to meetings, but none of them actually did anything. None of them contributed any money from their funds to the campaign. And the other experience I've got is that in Lowestoft, we've just lost our local record office, the archive, which actually was just a local studies. And I've been amongst sort of people in a political party who on the and talking about the county council, and the aside is, oh, well, people aren't really interested in that, are they? And it's really interesting because none of these people come from Lowestoft, and in Lowestoft it is a big issue, and it's we are a very working class town, and this is our history and heritage is really important to us. But we've got people from outside deciding that it's not really important. What are we bothering about that for? It's just for old people, and this whole thing about it's just for old people, or it's just and it's suddenly that class and age has really, that yes, lots of the people who were involved in adult education might well have been quite middle class, but there was a sense of which, as it existed, it could draw in lots and lots of other people. And what we've lost is we've lost any sense of being able to organise, because we can do small things on our own, but actually we really need the support of the big hitters. I mean, I've been in meetings where I've basically said a community group cannot save this institution. We need the city council on board, we need the county council on board, and yet the people within that are in a way newcomers and don't see the significance significance of it. So your point about gentrification, I just found like, oh my God, yes. What a really good one. And just an aside about the health and well-being, I met somebody yesterday who organised art courses for 30 years in this institution across Norfolk. And he gave the story of just how important just being able to go to some sort of course like that. He said a woman came up to him at the end of a sort of a 12-week course, and she said, "You basically stopped me from committing suicide." She said, "My husband died and I was so low, and this has saved me."
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God, that is such a huge responsibility. And yet, if you don't have those courses, you've got isolation, you've got older people. I mean, and a good friend of mine who's like in her 80s and has really campaigned for it said, well, does it matter if you've got all these older people doing the courses? Because actually, if they're doing the courses, they're not in the GP's waiting room, waiting to be seen for depression and isolation and everything else. Learning makes you better. It gives you well-being. And we've forgotten that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's really powerful. Thanks, Susan. I mean, I think all those points all come back to the point that I think Linden made, I feel, that it's about these people that Ian's described, Ian Hewitt, and there's something about a kind of imaginative bypass that some of these people seem to have had, and the fact that you're describing similar types, I think, Susan, in these meetings, and I think we have a duty, don't we, going back to all the comments in the chat, which are fantastic, about trying to capture people's imagination. And I really think, so Jane said in the chat, which I just think is lovely, a marvelous morning. I'm taking internationalism and Sharon's dad's point about the right wing not wanting us to improve ourselves particularly. She says, however, one optimistic point is that our local adult education centre, actually I've been reading about this only recently, in Leicester is still managing to provide humanities course via wellbeing funding. Less optimistic, at Leicester Vaughan College, a co-op founded out of the closure of Leicester University's adult education, is still not able to gain any funding. I know about this, having read about it recently, and is currently needing to explore privatised provision if there's to be anything to offer. We have launched discovery circles recently, free, self-led, co-op learning. So thank you so much for all the wonderful examples in the chat as well. And to Thomas, I think your point about it's more important than ever to celebrate workers' history, learning, community making. I think it absolutely is. If that's all we can do, I'm certainly committed individually to, and I know others are, to trying to celebrate and foreground these histories, so they can't be ignored and lost. Yeah. So, and I think it was Lindsay's point. She said it's very sad to see that they want to erase the histories and then move forward as if they didn't happen and are no longer important. They are important. These are the things that unite communities, and there feels a sense of almost wanting to divide the communities instead now, as then a divided community is easy to control and conquer with new ideologies. Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, thank you very much to everybody. I'm going to hand back to Ian to wrap up because I've gone on a bit.
No, not at all. I mean, this is a thought that links both to what you just said, Sharon, the comments and the links that we've added. And a thought, I think, that what have we done before? What we've done before is we've posted the recordings of each event, and that itself has been really powerful. I think one of our unresolved issues is exactly what you've just said about how we spread and write up. It's Linden's point about creativity and ways of writing up what it is that we've talked about today. And yes, through something like a special issue of Forum magazine. A number of us have contributing to individual chapters in that. It could be that the Centenary Commission website may be a place where we could post some of what we've spoken about today. So some of those stories maybe, because I think that's what we've got to think about, is as well as the spoken word, which is really powerful to people to listen back to from today, it's thinking about different ways of publishing and ways of actually spreading the word, and spreading the word, as Linden has said, in creative ways. So, you know, that could be in forms like the example at the Kent Mining Museum of an exhibition. So I think that to keep thinking about that, and that actually links to next week. Sharon and I have got meetings with a couple of the people who, Sharon, you interviewed as part of and worked with as part of your PhD, thinking about the way in which we can begin to think about what we might broadly call arts-based links with lifelong learning and education. And I think we want to listen to some ideas next week and bring those back to people so we can circulate after we've, this is someone, Sharon, I don't know whether it's worth just very briefly mentioning at the end. This is a possibility of where I think we can think about both an event early in the new year, but sustain this way of actually thinking about different ways of publishing and spreading the word.
Absolutely agree. And I think the point of certainly those conversations, and I know we've started to talk about this in the steering group that sets the events up within the research circle, as well as this notion that I'm getting increasingly preoccupied with, that more and more it's the working classes are excluded from arts activities, and that in all kinds of ways. I'm incredibly passionate about it, including film, including theatre, including music, and I've got experience of that. And I think this is something we want to look at, and the role of bodies like the some of the big funding bodies. Not that we're going to get drawn too much into that, but you know, the history of some of those organisations that have historically funded but no longer fund working class activism and the arts. So without getting too political, that's kind of at least part of the thinking, not the only thinking. But I also think Olga's point in the chat, there's something really vital about us capturing these stories on an intergenerational level as well. There's something about the solidarity that brings, and that I think the arts in the various forms is something we can perhaps focus on and develop into the next year. But any ideas, please, you know, about how we capture, and I mean, I would dearly love to start capturing people's individual stories much more. It's literally time doing a full-time day job and having no financial or at the moment no research funding to do this work that I really want to do it. So, but at the moment I'm just doing it in odd drips and drabs of time in my own time, basically. So if anyone wants to suggest ways we can bring this to life, this more imaginative attempt to archive this powerful and experimental education, please come to me and Ian, or just email us, or email Linden, email any of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Sharon. I think this has been another great event, and I think that the power of the core presentations, but also these discussions and what we've had in the thread has been
wonderful.
Has been excellent.
Yeah.
I think that's been great.
Great source of hope, may I say? Yeah. To me, anyway.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Linden, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything to finish off, because you've
one thought I did have, when we started things before, we talked about adult learning right back in 2020, whenever it was, and we weren't really aware of what was going on, and we called for people to share their experiences of particular projects, some of which were extraordinarily moving. There was one in Hull, I think, dialogical work with Syrian refugees, as I recall, which I found very meaningful. I'm wondering whether one of the things we can usefully do is to appeal. We've talked about the creative, the imaginal, the heartfelt, the intellectual, yeah, but that only takes us so far. I think we can all more or less agree on that. And I'm wondering what is going on, whether we can make a call in a similar sort of way. And don't be backward in coming forward. Share your effort to write the poem or to make the film or to write the novel or whatever. So we get into that cultural imaginal level, which I think we all agree is so important. So part of the work of the research circle is actually to begin to establish a little bit better just what is going on and what is going on that we can all learn collectively from.
Yeah. No, I think to actually perhaps it's the wrong word after today to use the word re-energize. I don't mean that. But what I mean is this links to Olga's point, actually, and I think something we've talked about before, about potentially involving younger adults in terms of looking at a range of things that are actually out there and that are happening that we may or may not be aware of. I think that idea of a call is a really excellent idea, and I think as well the organising of this and the funding of this has all sorts of challenges, but today's been a great example of how meeting online for just over 2 hours has actually worked really well. I mean, behind the scenes, over the last sort of 4 to 6 weeks, sending out invitations, that's something that I've been able to do. I think actually meeting together is something that we've talked about before, but we have never done. We have never actually met. And I think something where if we put out a call to actually showcase and celebrate through, and that could include things like, a lot of it's much more organising, but like an exhibition, like a performance, like the use of music and so on. I think there's a lot of possibilities, but it's whether logistically we can do that, how that will be funded, but I think that there is something there. Matt, I don't know whether yourself and John have final points, and then we need to pull it
just
together.
A quick one. If you wanted a room to meet, I can get you one.
A room?
A room or a conference hall or something like that. I can get you.
Okay, so as long as you're not talking about the Bet365, we'll be
No,
all
it
right.
won't be. It would be in Birmingham.
Oh, okay.
Most
Well, that's
likely.
okay.
Birmingham
That's
or
all right.
Coventry. So.
Good, I like that. The Midlands. I approve of that. That's good. Yep.
Thank you.
John, final point. John Player, you had your
No. What's that? I was just using the clap signal.
Oh, you clap. Oh, very good.
Good stuff. Well done. Well done.
Yeah, you're embracing emojis. Brilliant. Okay. Well, that's been great, Sharon. I mean, let me put back to you and Linden for final words. I'll stand back.
Yeah, just want to thank everyone and all the fantastic sort of suggestions and comments that are coming in through the chat as well. And I'm really struck by Ian Hewitt's last comment about a pageant, because Tom talked about that in the last session. Though I'm not organising a pageant, I wouldn't know where to start. But thank you for that. But I think the idea of us being a collective resource to one another is a great idea, and we may not entirely need to rely on the Centenary Commission website. In fact, I would suggest we don't.
No.
I'm thinking about ways myself at the moment of promoting some of this work, so maybe we can talk about that.
Just a very quick point. I was struck about, well, that's just for old people. But the powerful thing coming through for me is the importance of intergenerationality.
Yeah.
That we're not, there are such powerful things to learn and to become more aware of in relation to intergenerational experience. And maybe that's another theme we can pick up a little bit later.
Yeah.
People do engage with this in all kinds of interesting ways. In a sense, the past is not dead.
No.
Our ancestors are not dead. They can come alive again in us. And I think it can be an important resource of hope, if I could just finish with
I think that's absolutely right.
A gesture towards Raymond.
Yeah, brilliant, Linda. Totally agree. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We'll be in touch. Okay.
We will. Good to see everybody.
Well
Thank you
done.
very much, guys.
Take
Thank you
care.
very much
Thanks,
indeed.
everyone.
Cheers.
Bye bye
See you
now.
again.
Bye bye.